Welcome back. All right, so before the summer came around, I did discuss that I was thinking about doing a series on what ifs. What ifs from the hockey world, the National Hockey League. And today I wanted to focus on trades and what if with trades being made or not being made, how that would have changed things, changed players' careers, changed the trajectory that franchises are on. So, that being said, let's go ahead and jump right in. So the what if, and right at the top, this has to be on the board, doesn't it? So what if Wayne Gretzky, when he was traded out of Edmonton, what if he'd ended up in Vancouver or Detroit? So if he hadn't gone to LA, first off, if he doesn't go to LA, do we get a Mighty Ducks movie? Do we get a Mighty Ducks team that becomes the Anaheim Ducks? Do we get the San Jose Sharks? Did the LA Kings become what they became when Gretzky got there? Did they become that hub for celebrities to go see games? Did they become the hottest ticket in the game? Or would we still just have one team in California? Would that have changed, that expansion south? A lot of talk about, Gary Bettman going into the south, but that expansion into the south may very well not have happened if Gretzky doesn't get traded to the Kings. And there was a chance he could have gone to Detroit. That could have changed things for Detroit. I'll just talk about the Detroit thing for a minute. So in 88, when the trade takes place, Detroit is a good team. They're not a bad team. And if you add Gretzky to that team, you'd have Gretzky and Yzerman down the middle. So that would change everything for Detroit. Detroit wins the Cups in 97, 98, 2002, and 2008, right? But if you add Gretzky to that team in 88, the whole story changes. And it's possible that maybe they win a cup earlier than 97, and maybe they don't win that cup in 97. Because once you've put Gretzky on that team, you've completely changed everything. And the assets you would have had to give up to the Oilers definitely would have been some sizable assets. Although that Gretzky trade was won handedly by the LA Kings, there's still some draft picks handed in there and some money and things of that nature that if Detroit had to give those up, who knows what draft picks they might have given up and what the team would have looked like going forward if they had acquired Gretzky. So maybe it would have made Detroit a champion sooner, but hurt them long term. And then with Vancouver, I don't know that adding Gretzky in 88 would have made the Canucks a Stanley Cup champion. I don't know how much better the team would have got. And when you look at the history of the Canucks and you look at what happened when Messier got there, what's to say that Gretzky might not have had a tough time in Vancouver too? We know that the amount of scrutiny you get in Vancouver is a lot. The Vancouver Canucks were a team that was not good at that point in time. The assets the Canucks would have had to give up to the Oilers would have completely changed their trajectory going forward. We may not have got a Vancouver Canucks team that went to a Stanley Cup final in 1994. We may have seen some changes in Vancouver as a result of Gretzky getting there, right? So I do think that the ultimate what-if question is, what if Gretzky doesn't go to LA? And of course, then the ultimate would be, what if he ends up staying in Edmonton? I think they probably win the Cup again in 89. They definitely still win the Cup in 1990. And beyond that, who knows? Gretzky's points total stayed high in the 90s, but his goals did drop off, and he wasn't as dominant as he'd been during the 80s. So, there's your question on that one. Now, what's interesting is, the next one on the board is, what if the Eric Lindros trade hadn't been okayed with Philly? What if the arbitrator that came in ruled the Rangers trade, that one's the one that's legitimate, we're gonna honor that one. So, Lindros doesn't go to Philly. We don't get the Legion of Doom line. We probably don't get a Philadelphia team that goes to the Stanley Cup in 97. But Peter Forsberg stays in Philadelphia. Ron Hextall stays in Philadelphia. Those draft picks stay in Philadelphia. Like, a lot of the assets they gave up for Lindros to just stay there. Maybe Philadelphia is a better team earlier, like I said, with the Red Wings and Gretzky. And maybe we don't see the Philadelphia Flyers end up failing in the Stanley Cup run. Maybe with all those assets staying there, right? And then with the Rangers, if the Rangers get Lindros, does the 94 Stanley Cup take place? Probably not. The assets that were being offered up for Lindros included Tony Amonte, who was traded out before that 1994 Cup. Well, if that asset's gone and you add Lindros was a dominant player in the National Hockey League. Absolutely was. But it would change the whole chemistry of the New York Rangers. and giving up as much as the Rangers would have. And I believe, was it Richter or Van Beesbrook? It was one of the two. You're completely changing that Rangers makeup. And so maybe the Rangers don't win that 1994 Stanley Cup. Sort of like if Gretzky doesn't go to the LA Kings, do they go to that final in 93? Probably not. You might have got that Leafs Stanley Cup final against Montreal instead. So that butterfly effect with Gretzky and Lindros is very similar. Would have affected multiple franchises and pretty much would have affected the whole league. So Lindros ends up going to Philly instead, and Gretzky, of course, goes to the LA Kings, and we have all these teams in the southern U.S., partly because of Gretzky's going down to the States. Now, Eichel. So I wanted to touch on this one. What if the Buffalo Sabres had told Jack Eichel, this disc replacement idea you have, no NHLer's ever done it, but you believe in it, so we're going to let you do it. They let him do it, and what if they let him have that surgery and Eichel said, you know what, I'll stay in Buffalo. So if Eichel had stayed in Buffalo, do they make the playoffs between when he gets traded and now? I want to say probably not. The interesting part being if Eichel stays in Buffalo, doesn't go to Vegas, doesn't win that Stanley Cup in Las Vegas in 2023, we are probably still talking about Jack Eichel never playing a playoff game and the narrative that Eichel wasn't a good enough player to get a team into the playoffs would still be there. We would still be talking about it. And the interesting part is, if he'd had that disc surgery and come back and played, would Vegas have ended up getting him at a later date? Would Buffalo still have ended up saying, you know what, this isn't working, and still have looked to move Jack Eichel, even though things were going relatively, let's just say the relationship between the player and the team still fine, would Buffalo have still decided to make a move? I don't think so. I think a franchise player like Eichel you hold on to, but it is interesting to think about, isn't it? Now, if the original Winnipeg Jets, so this is prior to the move to Arizona, if they hadn't traded Teemu Selanne. Teemu Selanne had that ridiculous first year in 92-93, 76 goals scored, and he was the face of the team, right? Eventually he gets traded to the Ducks, a trade which didn't make the Jets better, definitely made the Ducks better. If he's not traded, there's one or two things that happen here. Either he goes with the team to Arizona, which could have really changed things for Arizona, but what if that had helped to stop that move? What if Selanne staying in Winnipeg, if the Jets had gone on a nice long run, what if that had helped? And I know it's highly unlikely that the Jets would have been prevented from moving to Arizona if things were going better on the ice, but at least the team wouldn't be looking at the Canadian dollar as much and saying, well, I don't know if this is going to work. I don't think this is going to work long term. So it is, I think of the ones I've discussed so far, the idea of Selanne staying in Winnipeg is more interesting from a perspective of what that might have meant to the Arizona Coyotes if Selanne had been part of those Jets that go down to Arizona, along with Keith Tkachuk and various other players. I think Arizona would have been a lot better. I think then, by virtue of that, maybe Arizona has better luck in the playoffs, and maybe we're having a totally different discussion about the Arizona Coyotes. So I'm doing this just on the whole, if they were traded or if they weren't. But if this video does well, and if there's a lot of feedback that people like this kind of idea, I want to do this with free agency, and I want to do this with teams as well. That's the reason I'm mentioning with Selanne, both the Jets and the Arizona Coyotes, because we know that Winnipeg moved very soon after Selanne was traded to Anaheim. So Joe Thornton got traded by Boston to San Jose. The biggest surprise was that he wasn't really shopped before that. Basically, it was a deal that came down to the two GMs knowing one another. And I've always wondered, and it's part of the reason this video is being made today, and part of the reason I had this idea of what if the Boston Bruins had let every team in the league know Joe Thornton is available? Joe Thornton was having a very good year for the Boston Bruins. I remember at the time, I think it was Edmonton that came out and said, we could have beat that offer. I seem to remember Edmonton coming out and saying, we could have beaten that offer if we'd known that Joe Thornton was available. We definitely would have offered a better package than San Jose. And the package that Boston got back in the Joe Thornton trade definitely was underwhelming, comparatively speaking, with what Joe Thornton did when he got to San Jose, where he ends up scoring a bunch of points, winning himself a Hart Trophy, and then he becomes a legend for the San Jose Sharks. If Boston had let the NHL know, at the very least, it could have increased the price that San Jose had to pay to get Joe Thornton, and Boston might have got a much better deal out of it, because Boston's decline in the mid 90s, mid to late 90s, was stark. And the trading of Thornton didn't help pull them out of that either. So he had been the number one draft pick. He was the guy they were building around. And then suddenly he's gone to San Jose. While a lot of fans, myself included, were left saying, didn't know he was available. Now, Brian Burke. Brian Burke went to the draft and picked both Sedin twins. And looking back at that draft was thin on prospects. So, and this is trade related because Burke had to make some magical trades with Chicago and Atlanta. Or Chicago, there was Chicago, Atlanta, and Tampa were all involved in that, right? The idea that Burke wanted that 2 and 3 spot to draft the Sedins, and he got it. He went into that weekend with the idea of, I'm coming out with both Sedins, and it happened. It was absolute magic by Brian Burke. However, for the purpose of this video, what if a GM had said, nah, I like Daniel Sedin. I'm taking Daniel Sedin. And what if the Canucks were forced to take one Sedin instead of both? I think this would have negatively impacted both players' careers, because when the Sedins were playing in Vancouver, it took years for them to build themselves up to be top-notch players. They are examples of why I don't give up on players early in their careers. Because I was one, too, that about year 3 for the Sedins, I was like, yeah, this just isn't working. I'm not sure what the Canucks are seeing in these guys. So if they'd been separated, I think it could have been even more difficult for them to reach that next level. And considering then you're looking at 2 different franchises with 2 different players, either we see a trade to get them to play together to see if that'll spur something, or maybe one of them ends up going back to Sweden. Maybe it just doesn't work at the NHL level at the point where, I mean, eventually they would have come back. They were too talented not to play. But if Brian Burke hadn't landed both Sedin twins, I think their trajectory in their careers would have been completely different. And so Burke being able to make the trades that allowed him to get both players, absolutely genius on his behalf. And he definitely pulled the wool over the eyes of other general managers that day. Now, one question for Islander fans that I'm sure that for fans that are old enough to remember, you might be, this might be something you think to yourself. They had a young Roberto Luongo, and the Islanders were in a rebuild. Well, the number one prospect, number one draft pick that year was going to be Rick DiPietro. So Mike Milbury decides, well, we don't need 2 future number one goaltenders. So Luongo, who had a rough start with the New York Islanders, honestly, he did. But as a rookie goaltender, it happens. And the Islanders weren't a fantastic team, for sure. So the Islanders trade Luongo. They draft DiPietro. And DiPietro's their goalie of the future. But in the event that the Islanders had decided, you know what, we're going to keep Luongo, and then one of 2 things. You either trade the number one draft pick, if DiPietro's for sure that number one pick, or you draft somebody else. And the trajectory for the Islanders then changes. Not only that, but Luongo going to Florida. Luongo played really, really well in Florida, had a tremendous run. Now he's back in Florida, of course, in management, and has a couple of cup rings. So if the Islanders had kept Luongo and decided, no, this is our guy, we know DiPietro's going to be really, really good, and DiPietro had some good years before injuries started to really take him out. But if they'd passed on DiPietro and kept Luongo, we may not have Luongo's Florida Panther status, which then would mean Luongo might not end up in Vancouver either. Maybe he stays with the New York Islanders. So there's a lot of butterfly effect to the whole fact that Luongo ends up going, DiPietro comes in, DiPietro gets that ridiculous 15-year contract. So Luongo probably would have got the 15-year contract. He did sign a long-term contract in Vancouver, which eventually Vancouver's paying the penalty for, and that's something else that might not have happened in the event that the Islanders said, we're going to keep Bobby Lou. So it is fascinating to go through this and kind of, pull that one thread and realize the whole thing can fall apart. Now, Columbus. Columbus sadly lost both Panarin and Bobrovsky, right, as unrestricted free agents, and they went for it. They did everything they could to try to make sure they could keep Panarin. But what if Columbus had admitted this isn't going to work? What if they had admitted that Panarin and Bobrovsky, they're going to leave as free agents anyways? What if they traded them at the deadline as pending unrestricted free agents? There's definitely, I think, some benefit to that. They get assets back for both. Of course, the knock on that would be they'd be pulling themselves out of the hunt for the playoffs. And for a fan base in Columbus that really hasn't seen the playoffs often enough, even at this point, they have not seen the playoffs nearly often enough, would that have hurt the franchise to trade away Panarin and Bobrovsky and to admit defeat there? Because right up until Panarin becomes a free agent and signs with the Rangers, Columbus really did try everything. They did the Hail Mary on the contract to try to keep him, and it just didn't happen. So for Columbus, if you trade Panarin and Bobrovsky, you get assets back, but you're also looking at a team that then very likely misses the playoffs, and you might have more trouble bringing in other free agents if it's seen that you're a franchise that'll just fold rather than try to hold on to assets. So there's definitely good and bad if they decided to move Panarin and Bobrovsky at the deadline that year. Now, there's a twofer with Detroit, because there are two rumored trades with Detroit that would have changed everything. In 1995, the Detroit Red Wings were considering trading Steve Yzerman to Ottawa for Alexei Yashin. It didn't happen, but in 1995, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not Yzerman was really the right guy for Detroit to win the Stanley Cup. And this trade, which was considered at some level, would have definitely made a difference, because Alexei Yashin, you look at his playoff record, which in 95 wouldn't have existed yet, Yashin's playoff numbers were not great. Yzerman's at the time were definitely better than what Yashin's would be, but there was that perception that you aren't going to win a Stanley Cup with Steve Yzerman. And there was, at least at some level, discussions it would fall apart. And I'm sure for Detroit fans, it's a thank God that fell apart. But it could have taken place. Absolutely could have. Detroit also considered at one point trading a pending unrestricted free agent named Pavel Datsyuk. They just couldn't come to a contract extension agreement. So what they considered was trading him to the New Jersey Devils. Devils fans just went, wait, what? And they were going to trade for pending unrestricted free agent Scott Gomez. Ultimately, Brains took over and said no, because Datsyuk going to the New Jersey Devils for Scott Gomez would have gone down very badly in history in hockey, and Detroit fans would still be talking about it. Because if you take Datsyuk off the Detroit Red Wings, do they win the Stanley Cup in 2008? My answer would be probably not. So that's one that definitely, when you look at it, you realize, that really would have completely changed things for New Jersey and for Detroit going forward. Because Scott Gomez, while he was a good forward, and I liked Scott Gomez, he was no Pavel Datsyuk. And I don't think that's going to be a controversial thing for me to say. I know people get upset during the summer at things I do or don't say about players because there's no hockey. You might as well get mad at me. But the reality is that, Datsyuk, definitely a Hall of Fame level player. Gomez, probably not. And so, Datsyuk, there's still the argument about whether or not he was a perfect hockey player. I think he was close. I don't think there's any hockey player that's truly perfect. But if you're in the conversation as a perfect player, whether you are or you're not, the fact you're in the conversation is impressive enough. And then what I wanted to end off with for this video, Craig Janney. So Craig Janney was awarded to the Vancouver Canucks. Peter Nedved goes to St. Louis. Janney's going to Vancouver. Craig Janney said, the hell I am. Nope, not going to Vancouver. Craig Janney immediately became persona non grata for Canuck fans. I was already not a Craig Janney fan. When the Boston Bruins traded Craig Janney, I was pretty happy at the time about it because I was not a big fan of Craig Janney. There was just something. I wasn't a big fan of Janney. I didn't feel like he was a guy that was going to elevate a team to win a championship. So when he did not accept the trade to Vancouver, I might have been one of the few Canuck fans that said, oh, thank God. Okay, all right, perfect. Because while I understood what Vancouver was trying to do by bringing in Janney, he's the center, he's a playmaker, And the idea of having Janney playing with potentially Pavel Bure, oh, that could have been great. But they traded him back to St. Louis, and they pick up Jeff Brown and others, and then they went to the Stanley Cup final, while the St. Louis Blues did not. So if Craig Janney had accepted the trade to Vancouver, we probably don't get the run in 94. I don't think that if you take Jeff Brown especially off the team, that the Vancouver Canucks go all the way to the Stanley Cup final in 94. Janney would have definitely helped down the middle, but I don't think that would have been enough to get them, I would say, even out of the first round. I don't know if they get out of the first round against the Flames. They were down 3-1. They had to win 3 straight games in overtime. It was a razor's edge that they got through that. So by not trading Janney back to St. Louis for pieces that were very important for that run in 94, that run in 94 probably doesn't take place. So in the end, I ended up being very grateful to Craig Janney for not coming to Vancouver. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe in the event that you may not have done so already. This was just, like I said, it was a fun idea I had. And I thought, I'll put all this stuff on the board. I'll talk to all the fine people on the internet. We'll see how it goes. So let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And what life-altering trade do you remember and think, if that hadn't been made, how would things have been different? And I want to do videos on this with the draft and what if this team took this player or didn't take this player. I also think it'd be fun to do one on free agency, free agents that were signed or not, guys who re-signed and stayed one place rather than going to free agency. I kind of feel like this is something we could do a lot of discussions on. But let me know your thoughts. You guys will decide. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't already, as I said. And with that said, thanks for all your time. I will talk to you again soon.